All right, how are we doing, Miss Megan?
Well, do you want to make maybe some opening remarks about the task force, what you guys did, and the report that you released today?
Okay. We good? Everybody's, am I okay? Ovi, you good?
Yep, perfect.
So I guess we should introduce ourselves. My name is Vince Carilli. I serve as the Vice Chancellor for Student Life here at the University of Tennessee. And
yeah, my name is Ovi Kabir, and I'm the current student body president.
So the university has been involved in a conversation over the past couple of years with several student leaders, really starting a couple of SGA presidents ago with our dear friend Carson, and then with Morgan last year. But the university was engaged with our students about a conversation regarding the current alcohol policy. We agreed to kind of open up a conversation about that policy really under Chancellor Cheek toward the end of his term, and then Chancellor Davenport picked up on that and created the Alcohol Policy Task Force just over a year ago, I guess it was. I'm not exactly sure when it was. But we had a task force that was comprised of students, faculty, and staff, and alumni. One of our alums, Bart Graham from down in Atlanta, chaired the group. The group met, I don't know how many times over the course of the past academic year, and developed a report that was released this morning through my office. It was uploaded to our Alcohol Policy Task Force website. It's available there for public review, but it really speaks to the work of the task force and some recommendations that they have created related to the possibility of the institution amending its current alcohol policy. At the request of our students, again, and engaging our students in this conversation, as well as faculty and staff, we had an opportunity through the task force to look at a bunch of different issues that were happening and really to start to think about is there a possibility for us to amend the alcohol policy on our campus. So that report was accepted by the university, and as promised when we got started with this process last year, we told our academic community that we would make that report public as soon as we got it, and we had a chance to review it. So this morning was the release of that document to the public.
Great. Well, Dr. Carilli, I appreciate it. I know that obviously your relationship with students is huge. How important was getting that feedback, especially from the students on this, because obviously it affects the students quite a bit?
It does. So, when we started this conversation years ago, like I had said, students were really integral to the process. And there is a document inside of the one of the appendices of the report that really speaks to the work that our Student Government Association did a couple years ago when they surveyed a group of their students and said, hey, tell us a little bit about your thoughts about this. Once Carson received all that information, again, Carson was a former student body president, he presented that to me and several other administrators and said, this is what our students are talking about, and therefore we want you to kind of look at this. So Carson really started the ball rolling, if you will, and then kind of turned it over to Morgan last year, who really operationalized the work of the task force by us sitting down with Chancellor Davenport and doing that work. And now it's Ovi's turn to kind of take over and really to work with us in terms of reviewing those recommendations. I think the interesting thing about the process that we undertook was the fact that when we developed the task force, we had talked about gathering feedback from our campus community. And so we put together a online survey that we did, and Melissa, who's over here, was responsible for really working with me on that. And interestingly, when we released the link to the survey, about 2,000 people responded to the survey in the first hour that it was up on our website. That's probably over and above anything we've ever seen about a response. And then over the next 2 weeks, another 2,000 people responded. So we had just over 4,000 responses, but the first 2,000 came in the first hour. So I think there was an appetite for really digging into this question and looking at it.
Absolutely. Do you see these recommendations actually taking effect? Do you feel confident about it? I read over them. I feel like you guys thought of a lot of different things as far as implementation. You understand it's going to be hard. There's going to be challenges. But do you actually see them taking effect here? I mean, it's a strong possibility.
Yeah, I think that the possibility of some of those recommendations being accepted is real. I don't know, and I would not commit to all of them being accepted, but I do think certainly that the process that we're looking at now is for really the Chancellor's Cabinet and our student leaders and everyone really digging into these recommendations to say, what is actually possible? Where are we at? So that's really what the process looks like now moving forward. We have the report, we have the recommendations, and now we've got to dig into the recommendations and say, what does this actually mean?
Gotcha. And will the amount of review ultimately be too much for different departments? Because I as I said, implementation is going to take a lot. And I read where you guys had tried to consider some of that, that maybe moving some of the responsibility from the departments to maybe some other folks. Do you feel like it might be too much, or is it a good amount?
Well, I think we really need to dig into that question. From my perspective, everyone wants to know, how is this going to work? How is this going to work? I don't know yet. I think that we really have to sit down and start to think about if some of these recommendations are accepted and our university changes the policy, then we have to get into a pretty deliberate conversation about implementation. What does this mean? Who's going to do what? How are we going to control for and allow for the policy to be enacted in a way that really, from my perspective, really speaks to issues of the safety of our academic community, of our university community, which for me is really at the forefront of all of our conversations. And I think, to the credit of the task force, was really at the forefront of their conversation as well. Ovi, what are your thoughts about that in terms of implementation?
Yeah, about implementation, I'll roll it back just really quickly. I could reiterate everything you said, but it's really important that we've been side by side trying to work towards this. This has been an initiative that we worked. I can't take all credit for this because this is the work from my predecessors as well as the Greek community and so many other organizations around UT who've worked really hard to see this change. We saw the survey come out in February, or put out in February, and we saw such a big turnout for that. About actually 2,800 undergraduate students responded to that, and we said overwhelmingly that they supported to see some change go on. So this has been something that's been in the work for the past 3 years. We've worked towards it. And so right now, the ball's kind of in our court right now to see how we can move forward. This is just the first step of the process, but it's a step towards a good direction because we really want to just make sure that safety is a priority to all students, and we see this being the first step towards that.
How do the students feel about this? I mean, I know you have, outside of the survey maybe, just talking with your friends, maybe at a party or on game day or something like that, how do the students feel about this, just kind of off the cuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think students are happy about this change. I mean, I think they're looking forward to something happening about it because I want to really go back to the safety aspect of it. I mean, if we look at numbers right now, 40% of undergraduate college students are binge drinking. This is an issue right here, and it's really important that we have students be in a safe environment. So instead of doing something off campus where they can get hurt or issues happen, we can actually regulate what's going on. And so I think students really appreciate that we're taking this initiative, working with them, and treating them like adults. You're on this campus, you know how to work, and we want to help you do these things. So I would definitely say students are very happy about this.
What do you foresee moving forward, Obi? I know obviously there's a lot of changes and a lot of conversation that has to happen, but do you see this happening, maybe them taking on the recommendations here in a year or maybe 2 years, something like that?
Yeah, I can't really speak on the time length of the process because it's going to go up and up towards each person who has to review it. So our goal would hopefully be, sooner than later, of course. That's as quick as possible. But we want to make sure that it gets vetted right. This is just a suggestion policy part of it. Then the implementation will come by, and then we have to see how it's going to look like as a system as a whole. So,
Yeah, I think the implementation really is, where all the detail needs to happen. Should recommendations be approved to actually change the policy, then I think we've got to get into the how-tos of what is actually going to happen. What and how will this impact students, student organizations, academic departments, our campus community, whatever it may be. But that is work to be done. So we're not there yet. That is work to be done here in the future, but this was the first step in that process to get the ball rolling. Right now, our policy is such that it's somewhat different than what has been recommended. And as we looked at certainly peer and aspirant institutions and things like that, you've seen some of that on our website. Clearly other institutions do it a little differently than UTK does. And so that was our opportunity to really start to open this conversation to a much broader dialogue across our campus with our task force.
Absolutely. You guys got any questions? Sorry, I kind of monopolized that. Covered. Good to go.
You mentioned the part about the statistics about undergraduates binge drinking, and you said that this provides them a safe place. Can you clarify what you meant there?
Yeah, so I think it's really important that we create a culture where students aren't binge drinking before a game day or different areas. That when, if you're of the age and if you're consuming alcohol, that you do it in a safe area and you also have the information to do it. We find so many college students come to colleges, where they this is their first place of being able to consume alcohol. and drink responsible. So we want to make sure help students towards that. So the statistic of binge drinking, we want to see that go down. We want to see that students can be able to drink in the proper place if they're of the age, and have people help them out if any issues arise.
I think the idea really is something along the lines of, if you can have a drink or two in a controlled environment, the need or the desire to binge decreases dramatically, because you know that it's not something that you have to do before you walk into an event, before you walk into a game, before you do anything like that. But it's an opportunity to say, we can create an environment where we've got a safe environment, and so students don't feel like they have to drink 5 drinks. I'm making up that number. I don't know what the number is. before they walk in to kind of get my fill before I do this, because they know that this is now permitted by university policy through a controlled environment, through an event that occurs on our campus, so that students don't feel like they have to overconsume to kind of get their, quote unquote money's worth, if you will,
exactly.
before they walk out of this environment. So I think our hope is that, in what we've learned from other institutions, and certainly through practices that I've been familiar with in my role, is that if there are opportunities to have alcohol available, it really provides us with really 2 important things. The first is an environment that we can control, which is pretty important in terms of making sure that people are of age, are legally able to consume alcohol. But the other thing is to really teach our students a pretty important lesson about the role that alcohol plays in their life once they leave this place. And how do you effectively enjoy a drink of alcohol while you're on a job interview, as opposed to thinking, well, when I was in college, I had to do this really quickly, because now you're in a situation where you're in a civic group that you're involved with once you graduate, and what role does alcohol or the responsible consumption of alcohol play in that regard? And this is really an opportunity also to potentially educate our students about the important obligations that we have if we decide to involve ourselves in the consumption of alcohol.
Dr. Curley, I don't know if you want to clarify the SEC rules on events, but that remains the same, right? They still have that.
Yeah, so the question that has been asked by many during the course of this conversation with the task force really relates to the availability of alcohol at athletic contests, at concerts, things like that. Right now, the SEC conference has a conference policy that does not allow for the distribution of alcohol at athletic contests or athletic venues during an athletic contest. So because of the SEC rule, regardless of if the university changes its alcohol policy, we would need the SEC to change their policy before alcohol would be permitted to be distributed at athletic contests, regardless of the venue. So Neyland Stadium or Thompson Bowling or wherever else we would do anything. I will tell you that conversation with the SEC is happening, I would say, in fits and starts. I have not been involved with that, so I can't speak definitively of that, but I know that several of the other institutions have talked about it with me, folks who do what I do, vice chancellors, vice presidents for student life, student affairs. But the SEC is not ready to commit to any type of a change in that policy as of now. So regardless of what we do here in Knoxville, that may not have an impact on what happens athletically. It could potentially have an impact on what happens when we use some of those athletic venues for non-athletic events. So if we had a concert in Thompson Bowling and the university changed its alcohol policy, that could have an impact on what we do at a concert in the arena or something like that. But as of right now, for athletic venues, the SEC policy really prevails in that regard. Sure.
So the thing that comes to mind, though, when you say like binge drinking before an event, is obviously tailgate culture. So if the SEC is not changing it, how do you expect these recommendations to help decrease that possibility?
Well, I think that it's really important to note that when we think about tailgating, we have to think about the fact that those are usually 7 or 8 times a year. So there's about 358 other days a year that we're worried about as well. And that really precludes what happens on those 7 or 8 days that we have home games on. So I think that the policy potentially has a much broader impact than just what happens on game day. And I think that really, from my perspective, Ovi, I defer to you, but I think that our students are talking about a lot more than just game day. They're talking about what happens the other 360 days a year.
Yeah.
What kind of events then would alcohol be allowed at?
Well, I think that's to be determined. I think that one of the things that the policy starts to speak of is events that are registered with the university, and those events can be very varied. They can be student events, they could potentially be academic department events, college events, things like that. But we just don't know yet. I think that right now what we're talking about is really, from my perspective, how I would define it as an events-based policy change, which would mean you would register an event of some type and ask for permission to have alcohol be served at that event. My hope, based upon my read of the recommendations, would be that the alcohol would be provided by a third-party vendor, something like that, who can control the distribution and consumption issues associated with that. But again, that's all to be determined through an implementation process if the policy in fact does change.
So as far as rules for the SEC, say like Neyland Stadium, obviously alcohol would be allowed there. Would it be allowed, could it possibly potentially be allowed around campus for tailgating and things like that?
Well, yeah, the SEC policy speaks specifically of the sale or distribution of alcohol in general admission portions of athletic venues. So that really is, you know, a pretty significant portion of, in our case, Neyland Stadium or Thompson Bowling Arena. But clearly, there's a lot of consumption that occurs on our campus on game days and things like that. Speaking to the tailgate portion of your question, I think that this really is part and parcel to some of that, really creating a policy that speaks to some practice that already occurs, where there may be some inconsistencies.
Bobby, how does this reflect the role of student government? To me, this is a really great example and something you can point to where it took a few years, but this is probably one of the largest, I would say. I mean, I was a student here a few years ago.
Yeah.
Probably one of the largest things SGA has done in a long time. How would you say it reflects SGA's role here?
Yeah, you know, I think our biggest thing is we advocate for students by students, you know, and a lot of the things we do sometimes are behind the scenes, you know, we talking to administrators, we work different things, and this is one thing we can kind of put in the light and say, hey, this is something we've been working for, because it's really important that students have been asking for this for a long time. I bet even when you were in school, they were asking for it, so it really hasn't changed. So the steps we've taken in the last few years is really coming to fruition now. Again, this is only the first step of it, but I think this is a big thing that we can point at and say, SGA worked with other organizations, other students on this campus alongside administration and say, this is something we're working towards, and I mean, we have a voice on this campus and it's being heard, and so I'm happy about that.
Absolutely.
And they want me to ask, how important is the recommendation for regarding the allowance of alcohol at future married student housing or housing with all members over the age of 21?
Yeah, so the task force created a recommendation regarding married student housing or housing provided for students over the age of 21. We do not have married student housing. We do not have, as a general rule, graduate student housing. Some of you may recall, if you've lived in Knoxville for some time, that we did have that at one time. That was phased out because it just wasn't really utilized. We don't have any intention of having that, but I think that the task force wanted to kind of foresee maybe what potentially could happen in the future and added that recommendation. But as of right now, we do not delineate housing based on age to say, hey, anyone over 21, you can live in this building as compared to that building. But I think the task force was saying if at some point the university moves in that direction, one of the recommendations would cover that. So Daily Beacon want to know anything from us? We're good?
Yeah,
Okay. Anything else we need to talk about?
No, thank you guys for taking the time.
Thanks.
I really
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.